Okay. Great. Well, I'm really excited how our sort of lineup worked this morning because my presentation deals with an example of a megachurch that, as somebody put it, is trying to sort of join the party with popular culture. But there have been a lot of issues around their sort of authenticity, among other churches kind of criticizing what they're doing. And so I became interested in my topic because of a March 2016 blog post in which a Christian pastor named Nate Lee posted a blog with the provocative title, "Hillsong Church Do Not Colonize San Francisco." And this was in response to a video announcement that the international megachurch, which is called Hillsong, had made, and they said that they were intending to plant a new church in the Northern California city. And so in this surprisingly passionate and pull-no-punches blog, Pastor Lee argued that, quote, "Hillsong San Francisco has absolutely nothing to do with God's kingdom here in San Francisco." And subsequently, this blog post got a considerable amount of traffic, and the story was picked up both by Christian publications as well as local San Francisco blogs and so on. And this is another great quote from the Lee blog. He says, he's describing the notion of a Hillsong church, and he says, "What a perfect mix of yuppie fun and evangelistic intrigue. Of course the city needs saving, doesn't it?" But while it may seem like there's nothing noteworthy about what appears to be a kind of territorial spat between Lee and this Hillsong church, what caught people's attention about the blog post was a key word in the title, which ends up being a recurring theme throughout the post, which is colonize. And so Lee argues in both theological as well as political and economic terms that Hillsong's interest in San Francisco is disingenuous and it's primarily motivated by the church's financial interests. And so he begins the blog by equating Hillsong's proposed expansion with, quote, "real estate agents, developers, and city officials who have destroyed neighborhoods, broken up families, and displaced poor people of color for their own idealized dystopian visions of San Francisco." But then, rather interestingly, he also draws a parallel between the more recent sort of economic exploitation in the Bay Area that's been brought on by the economic boom there. And he equates that with the long history of oppressive colonial and imperial expansions that have been carried out by various Christian churches and ministries over the years under the auspices of spreading the gospel. And so I became interested, because of this blog post, in the emerging phenomena of not only megachurches, but the newer trend of multi-site churches like Hillsong, and particularly through the lens of globalization. And so I wanted to sort of think about the institution of the church, and there's been some interesting developments in how churches are expanding, and of course using media and digital media as part of that project. And so in my paper on this topic, I devote some time sort of thinking generally about Christianity, because I think it's important to think about the history here a little bit. And I explain that Christianity, I think, has always possessed what I refer to as an expansionist impulse, in the sense that, in the New Testament, there are these exhortations for people who are a part of the Christian movement to share the good news, to spread the gospel, to become evangelists. And so that's an important part of sort of the DNA of Christianity. But then also, when it comes to using media and using new technology, I describe these sort of two different logics or approaches to thinking about media. And I describe one of these, and these are sort of different approaches that I think the early Christian movement really synthesized, and it contributed to the growth and the success of the movement. But the first of these I describe as being an archival sensibility, which is derived from kind of the Israelite or the Hebrew media sensibility. And this seeks primarily to preserve and protect and celebrate the history and identity of the Israelite people. Whereas the latter sort of media logic, which I refer to as an empire model, is derived from the Greco-Roman media logic. And this focuses more on efficiently broadcasting a kind of universal, future-oriented corporate identity. And so, in theory, these two approaches have this great potential to sort of grow a community while also continuing to bind it together and reinforce the community. But realistically, it's also been a difficult sort of balance throughout the history of the church. And so, of course, the empire side of this kind of equation was co-opted by Constantine I, and that led to his civic appropriation and kind of the institutionalization of the Christian movement in the 4th century. And so that's been kind of one trajectory, but there have also been times where the more archival kind of side of this approach has caused the Christian movement to become this kind of seemingly archaic and stagnant institution rather than a dynamic and adaptive religious movement. And so, like I said, I think what's really important here to recognize in the case of Hillsong is that globalization in a very general sense and that kind of expansion impulse that I described, I think it's always been part of the DNA of Christianity in a unique way. But the question has always been to sort of how does that play out in a world full of politics and other complications. And we've continued to kind of see this in a lot of the more recent trends like fundamentalism, evangelicalism, neo-Pentecostalism, and also I think the decline of some of the older and more institutionalized iterations of Christianity in recent years. And currently, I think the biggest set of challenges for Christianity in general have come as a result of what we now collect under this umbrella term of globalization. And this is the most delightfully tacky image that I could find for this. So globalization, which includes urbanization, industrialization, individualization, mediatization, neoliberalism, and global capitalism. So all of that, globalization. And so anyway, moving on now to sort of mega churches and multi-site churches, which, as I said, is part of the sort of response to globalization. As the name suggests, the mega churches were initially defined according to the size of their congregations. And so in the U.S., in sort of the 1950s post-war baby boom, certain Protestant Christian churches began to see the size of their weekly attendance swelling into the hundreds and well beyond what was considered to be the normal size for a local parish church. And in the decades that followed, the churches and denominations not only began to devise formulas for increasing the growth and attracting this sort of mega level of attendance, but they also started to create entirely new churches that were more intentionally designed to fit into this emerging model. And it's difficult to sort of summarize all of the different factors that contributed to the spread of these churches, but of course it should be noted that electronic and broadcast mass media sort of stand out as one of the major factors. And televangelism ministries were typically produced by and depicted megachurches, and that played a major role in helping to disseminate this model because, of course, you could see what it looked like and kind of the style of preaching and that sort of thing, whether you were able to actually visit a megachurch or not. And so currently, megachurches continue to thrive. Here's Joel Osteen, who arguably is a Christian pastor. In his very large church. Sorry if there's any fans. But mega churches have continued to thrive. My parents would hate the fact that I just said that. They really like Joel Osteen. But so mega churches have continued to thrive in the U.S. and they've exploded globally in popularity, and specifically outside of Europe and the global West, in Asia, Africa, South America. And so this is just a rally held by the Yoido Full Gospel Church in South Korea. But some of the largest, this church in Seoul has 253,000 members. There's the Methodist Church in Santiago, Chile has 150,000. A church in Indonesia has 135,000. There's one in India with 120,000. So some of these mega churches are sort of pushing the mega envelope. But a more recent trend, which is still primarily located in the U.S., but it's kind of following a similar trajectory in terms of its spread, is the emergence of what have been called multi-site churches. And so according to one scholar named Todd Rhodes, the number of these multi-site churches in the U.S. Has blossomed from just about 10 in 1990 to over 5,000 by 2012. And the leaders of these churches typically claim that their new model, this multi-site model, actually represents a reaction away from the more impersonal megachurch. And so it's intended to be a kind of smaller local community where the congregants can connect with each other better and feel more invested in the church. But these multi-site churches are typically not smaller or any more diffuse when it comes to their leadership, their finances, their branding, and their media content production. And so from a business standpoint, this shift towards multi-site, I think, represents a restructuring from these single centralized megachurches that meet in one location into what is essentially a franchise model, comparable to the one developed by the McDonald's Corporation or arguably the Roman Catholic Church, depending how you look at it. And so while there are the more noble motives that I mentioned for making this switch from mega to multi-site, I think it's also, you could see this shift as a kind of strategic move that allows mega churches to continue to grow at an even greater rate and on a larger scale. And so Hillsong Church is a very unique example of this, and it's both a mega and a multi-site church, which was founded in Sydney, Australia in 1983. And it quickly went on to become well-known in a number of other countries based on the popularity of their worship music. So the church produced worship music, which they recorded and started to sort of export, and it became very popular. And so following that initial success with their music, they sort of ventured onto the global stage through musical tours, and so they started performing their material, typically in megachurches in other parts of the world. And eventually this made Hillsong a popular and recognizable enough brand that they could expand and start opening satellite locations as an international multi-site church. And so currently, Hillsong's reported to have over 25,000 members in over a dozen different locations, located in major metropolitan cities on 5 continents. And these were icons of their locations when I began this research. And since then, they've added more locations in Bali, Norway, Sweden, Israel, Portugal, and so on. And don't quiz me on the flags, because I just... But there's a few, I think, key aspects to their growth that make it stand out compared to other mega and multi-site churches. And the first is that they had really excellent timing. Because Hillsong's music was written and produced according to the aesthetics of the megachurch and the theology of neo-Pentecostalism at a moment when that was beginning to take off globally, they really offered a style of music that both sounded good in these different sort of acoustic spaces, but then it was also music that felt reverent enough to seem appropriate for a church service in those same large spaces. And around the time that Hillsong debuted, there was a feud happening within Christianity in the U.S. That's been referred to as the Worship Wars, which I think is just a splendidly ironic name. But it centered around this dilemma of trying to reconcile this arena-sized sort of musical sound with creating a liturgical atmosphere. And Hillsong actually did that very well. They were one of a few that were able to do that well. And then, like I said, similarly, their lyrics kind of walk the line between being explicitly Christian and yet theologically nebulous enough that they can have a very, very broad appeal, can be performed in a wide variety of different churches. And then second, what's very unique with Hillsong, unlike most megachurches, is that the music was the kind of the brand ambassador for the church. And so typically megachurches grow and rise to prominence primarily because of the work of one or a handful of very charismatic leaders, like Mr. Osteen. And so Hillsong's leaders, namely there's 3 generations now of the Houston family who have been the lead pastors of Hillsong. So they have gone on to be, associated with the Hillsong brand. This came after the church had already established itself globally through the popularity of their music. And then that in turn led to, I think, a third distinction about Hillsong, which is that it has not spread in a kind of organic fashion from a single location outward, kind of locally, regionally, nationally. But instead, they've been very strategic about setting up shop in these large international cities. And I'll go back to show a few. And so rather, for example, I live near Flatirons Church, which I think is the biggest megachurch here in Colorado. But, they've opened locations in Arvada or Westminster or something. But Hillsong, by comparison, is going from Australia to Moscow to France to Kiev, which is sort of unique in this space of mega and multi-site churches. But this leads back to Nate Lee's critique of Hillsong in 2016, because Lee recognized that Hillsong was not simply a megachurch expanding from a neighboring city into his own in order to accommodate growth, but San Francisco was chosen for some kind of specific reasons. And they were reasons that the pastor, Ben Houston, described as being related to the religious mission of the church. But Pastor Lee saw the reasons as being economically driven and related to furthering the Hillsong brand instead. And so the analysis, and I'm running out of time, but I did a sort of analysis looking at a few of the lenses in the globalization literature, and specifically thinking about kind of the business model or the way in which Hillsong is able to do this. And so just to go over a few of these really quickly, and this is some of Hillsong's music on the iTunes store too, just to explain what that is. But they have a lot of albums out, and starting to branch out into different styles and appeal to different demographics as well. But so one of these terms is McDonaldization. And so scholars looking at globalization have talked about the way in which McDonald's has, they use efficiency, it's calculable, predictable, controllable. And so Hillsong, through the music, the images that they use, typically the kind of arena spaces are very, it's almost like a blank canvas. And so they use lighting and music and video screens, but it's a very easy kind of an experience to package up and reproduce somewhere else very, very easily. And so there's elements of this that I think Hillsong has kind of picked up on. Another of these that scholars have talked about is the Disneyization or the Disneyfication. And so what Disney has done, and these include theming, which is the idea, if you think of a family spending a day at the park, Disney turns that into the theme park that you spend a day at, where every single aspect of the park has some kind of a Disney spin on it, or it's a Disney product. And so again, with Hillsong, the videos that are shown on the screen, the music, the whole experience has this kind of Hillsong brand stamped onto it. And so it's a kind of a theme church, if you will. And then the de-differentiation of consumption. There's a story, I don't know if I can get into it because I'm running out of time, but there's a great article from GQ magazine on Hillsong Church, and they talk about the hat. And so the pastor of this church wears a particular kind of hat every week. And the writer notices that a lot of the people in the congregation start to wear the hat. And of course, the hat has nothing to do with the religious teachings of Hillsong Church. They don't say you should wear this because of some kind of, part of our belief system. But this is the kind of de-differentiation of consumption, that they buy the hat as part of being, part of Hillsong, even though it isn't really explicitly, required or anything. But this is, just to explain, that is one of the Houston family members in the leather jacket, sitting courtside at a Knicks game with his close friend Justin Bieber, who's wearing the hat in the photo there. And a lot of pop stars like Selena Gomez, Justin Bieber, are very sort of well-known Hillsong attendees, and they've occasionally gotten up to sing with the worship band at Hillsong. And then finally, just a last, there's this idea of pastorpreneurs that I won't get into. But the final kind of effect from the globalization literature is they talk about the Walmartization, which I think would actually more accurately be a Walmart effect. And so the idea that when Walmart comes to town, it often forces a lot of small businesses out of business because they're unable to compete. And their scholars have found a similar effect when it comes to churches. And so with a church like Hillsong, it creates this interesting dynamic where local churches are in a position of, should we compete? Should we try to become a Hillsong satellite, campus ourselves? Or how will we respond to this? So I should probably wrap up there. I'm sure that was more than my last 5 minutes, but thank you.